Good morning. Welcome to this morning's Climate Action webinar from ETOA. My name's Tim Fairhurst, and I'm joined by four excellent experts who are currently sitting in Melbourne, Australia, Southwest France, in Madrid, and in the Netherlands. So I'm only going to say a few words at the beginning, and then each of the speakers will speak in turn, and there'll be plenty of time for discussion afterwards. I'm just going to say a few words of introduction by way of ETOA's position here and our appreciation of such experts joining us today, because this is an area where we know that the industry is keen to learn more, but the industry is busy trying to survive at the moment. So the top of the list is making sure that the tourism industry is here next year, and that is what a lot of people are focusing on who are running businesses. There is a long-term angle to sustainability that we can't ignore. We know it's a big topic for European policymakers. The EU is ambitious to be carbon neutral by 2050, and it has already increased its carbon reduction goals to 55% below 1990 levels by 2030. So there will be a change to regulatory frameworks. There'll be discussion about fiscal incentives and disincentives. This is a topic we have to get into, whatever our current preoccupations are with business survival. There are upsides, and it is certainly the case that companies who have found ways of adopting a sustainability agenda are reaching out to an audience they would not previously have got to, and it's certainly this creative possibilities around adopting a sustainability agenda that we're going to explore today, as well as all the other aspects of carbon offsetting, how to measure sustainability that we'll hear from our experts. So that's a very quick gallop through why we're having this webinar. It's topical, it's a strategic issue that is going to be part of tourism's life and in its business environment for the foreseeable future. And without further ado, I would like to start with an industry voice. Suzanne is speaking to us from Melbourne, Australia, but Intrepid also has a very big footprint in Europe and delivers a lot of programs here. Suzanne, welcome. Over to you. I will start the presentation now.
Cool. You just go to the first slide, Tim. Thank you. So thank you for inviting me here today to be part of this conversation. The next slide. As I'm based in Melbourne, Australia, I like to do an acknowledgement of country. I like to pay my respect and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this meeting today takes place, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and also pay respect to elders both past and present. As we share our knowledge, teaching and practices, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. Next slide. As the world's largest adventure travel company and a pioneer in sustainable travel for over 30 years, Intrepid has been a carbon neutral business since 2010, and in 2018 became the world's largest travel business to be a certified B Corp, meaning we are meeting the highest standards of verified social and environmental performance, public transparency, but also legal accountability to balance profit and purpose. As the environmental impact specialist, I'm responsible for all our climate action work, and that includes our climate change performance, reporting, but also working with the business to transition to a low carbon economy. This week is actually a really significant week for Intrepid Travel and for our decarbonisation work at the company. And it's really timely that I'm here with you today, and I will share more about this big announcement later in the presentation. But first, let me share with you a bit more of the background of how we got here where we are today. The next slide. So we haven't only recently become worried about climate change. In fact, our journey started back in 2005, when a group of senior managers read The Weather Maker by Tim Flannery about the history and future impact of climate change. And that started us thinking. Fast forward and feedback from our stakeholders, including our customers, we took definite action on climate, and we became the world's largest carbon neutral travel company in 2010. And since then, we have now offset more than 350,000 tons of carbon emissions worldwide. And we have implemented an offset inclusive carbon management plan that has us rewarded with benefits well beyond the carbon emission reductions. Slide 5. Next slide. So we certainly know that being carbon neutral is no longer enough. And based on the facts we know today, we would be actually lying up to ourselves if we were continue as though there's nothing wrong with the travel industry. And for this reason, in January, we actually declared a climate emergency with Tourism Declare. And it's great to have Jeremy today on this call, who is driving this globally. Next slide. So our climate emergency is underpinned by a 7-point commitment plan that you see here. It includes to continue to measure our emissions, to go 100% renewable in all our offices, but also to commit to science-based targets. And that means to committing to ambitious emission reductions targets through the science-based target initiatives by setting science-based targets in line with 1.5 future. The next slide. So earlier I mentioned that this is a really big week for ASEAN and Intrepid, and I'm thrilled today to share with you all that we are the first tour operator with approved science-based targets for a climate-safe future. And we are responding to a call to action for companies to set emission reduction targets in line with a 1.5-degree future. And that's backed by a global network of UN agencies, business, and industry leaders. Setting the science-based targets will see us reduce our emissions across our operations, but also across our trips, so really across the whole value chain. And that's for a 1.5-degree future. But our hope is really that we can use this rallying cry to the entire industry to take meaningful collective action on climate as a critical priority in travel post-COVID recovery. We simply can't rebuild at the expense of the planet. The next slide. So the approval of our science-based target is indeed a highlight of this year, but there has been actually other initiatives too. I understand that all things COVID are at the moment at the top of our minds now, but we mustn't lose of the broader sustainability issues, in particular climate change. While the pandemic poses a huge threat to the viability of our industry, climate change poses an even bigger long-term threat. And to help other travel business on their climate journey, I authored earlier this year a low barrier 10-step quick start guide to decarbonize your travel business, which is available to download on our website. And I hope you find it useful. And as next slide. And as I mentioned earlier, Intrepid has been a founding member of Tourism Declare, so I'm really pleased now to hand over to Jeremy.
Thank you, Suzanne.
That's great. I'm just going to draw the audience attention to the questions that they can. There is a facility on the right. If you wish to add your questions in text, please do. I'll be monitoring them through the presentations. So Jeremy, over to you.
Thanks, Tim. Thank you, Suzanne. You put my first slide up for me, Tim, please. Thanks. So in January this year, in fact, on January the 14th, a group of us came together and launched the initiative called Tourism Declares a Climate Emergency. I'd been paying attention to this sort of movement that had emerged over the last 3 years around the declaration of a climate emergency. In fact, started in Australia in the suburbs of Melbourne, in a suburb called Darebin. I think in 2016 was the first place in the world to declare a climate emergency. It proliferated over the years between then and now. We have 1,500 or so cities, villages, regions, countries, the European Parliament that have declared a climate emergency. So it very much began in place, the places that people live and that we as tourists call destinations. But a couple of years ago, this began to shift and also develop, and we started seeing sectors, industrial sectors, architects, designers, doctors began to declare an emergency. So you have creatives declare an emergency, architects declare an emergency. And so businesses started to declare. And I thought, well, this again mirrors very much what's unique about our industries, the way that we integrate the private sector's relationship with the places that we operate. And these architects and designers are the people that build our hotels. And then on top of that, there started becoming, there's such things as heritage declares an emergency, culture declares an emergency. What we saw coming out was the places that we go, the experiences, the way that we enjoy our tourism began also to declare an emergency. And this seemed to me that this was the component parts of our distributed networked industry, making its individual declarations, but maybe this was an opportunity for us to do so as well. And this, I began exploring this idea and thinking about it middle of last year. And then in May last year, Cyclone Kenneth hit off the Indian Ocean into the northern coast of Mozambique. And there was a lodge there called Galudo up in the Quirimbas archipelago. And it had been somewhere I'd visited a decade earlier when writing a book on responsible tourism. And it was one of those award-winning, got every award, done everything, did everything that we cherish in what tourism can do to uplift communities and preserve and protect nature. And after 10 years of working like this and winning all those awards, 5 minutes later, after the cyclone hit the beach, it was no more. The village was gone, the lodge was gone, the entire thing vanished. And I've seen this repeatedly around the world, that very much the nature of our industry is we like to go to the edge, to the beach, to the cliff, to the mountain, and to go places where we can be isolated, remote, close to nature, and have the chance to connect with rural communities. But these places by very nature are also the most fragile, the places that have the least infrastructure, the least support, and often by nature, we're the only one there. And this puts us hugely at risk, but also gives us a great opportunity. So in May last year, we began exploring what this might look like. January, beginning of the year, drop of the bushfires in Australia, 14 of us, 14 companies, including Intrepid, The Long Run, the names you can see at the bottom, and a few others, came together and we launched the climate emergency, the initiative. Tim, if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. And having paid a significant amount of attention over the years to the way that tourism develops its initiatives around sustainability, there were two things that I wanted to try to address. One is that while tourism can sign a lot of pledges and publish a lot of pledges, unless those pledges are tied to action, they risk not delivering on the sentiments that underpin them. And we wanted to make it absolutely sure that what we did was something that drove action. So we didn't just say, come to our website, tick a box, go back to your work and move on. Every company, every organization, every individual that has declared with us has gone onto their own website, announced, as you saw with Intrepid, that they declare that this is an emergency, and committed to the 5 commitments that are part of it. And the number one is perhaps the most important one, which is that they commit to developing and publishing a plan for what they will do. That plan will be shared publicly. Because we all have gestures of what we want to do, but to actually say, no, here is how we're going to do it. It's only by sharing those and by understanding where our challenges are, that we're each flawed, that we each have opportunities, and we each find other parts difficult, that we stand a chance of moving forward together. And that second commitment is that that will be shared publicly and that it will be updated annually. The third commitment is that it won't just be a random plan. It'll be a plan based in science. Suzanne referred to the science-based targets. The IPCC that we looked at when we wrote this likewise says we need to commit to cut emissions in half by 2030. A climate neutral, a carbon neutral goal, a net zero goal of 2050 is fine for a long-term ambition. But if we genuinely want to achieve it, acting early and fast and making the significant changes now gives us realistically the only real chance of doing it. And then our other two commitments are that this is to be collaborative. We're not here to compete on sustainability. We're here to work together. And we will advocate for change. We will build a voice inside of this industry that says we want to be part of the solution, not the problem that people are campaigning against. If you go to the next slide, Tim. Thank you. So we started in January and it went well. And in January and February, we were getting over a new signatory a day, and we reached up to 70 or so members by the end of February. And then, of course, the same thing that happened for everyone else in our industry slowed us right down in March. And all of a sudden, an emergency that we hadn't been declaring changed our industry forever. And so we've taken the last few months to look at what we should do, considering that we came to speak to an industry that was at its absolute peak, late January, early February 2020. And now we are talking to an industry that has never experienced a crisis like this. It is not the same situation that we previously were in. So we have talked to all of our members. We now have 116. And we said, what is it you need? And the consensus that has come across is that if anything, this experience has made people more committed and more aware of the need to prepare and to work together to deal with sustainability challenges, the climate emergency, the biodiversity emergency. But whereas in January and February, when we talked to people, everyone had capacity, everyone had the opportunity to put something aside to work on this. They had staff, they had revenue, they had experiences, they had trips. Now we have none of these. And what people said they need from us is support. And they wanted a sense of being something bigger. And so what we launched on Tuesday of this week, everyone's launching something this week. And we launched on Tuesday of this week, we launched our community platform for our members to support them in delivering their climate action plans, to say, come into the community if you are a member, if you work for Intrepid, anyone who works for Intrepid or any of the other organizations is welcome to be part of it. And we will connect you with experts. We will connect you with one another. And you can share your challenges and how you are trying to develop your climate action plans and how you are trying to not just reduce emissions, but prepare and build a tourism for our next chapter, a tourism for the next decades. And those conversations have just begun. As you see, these are literally taken from the last day or so. If you go to the final slide, Tim. Thank you. And what we are doing inside of this is sharing conversations, sharing challenges, sharing resources, talking about what it is that we use, what works for us and what doesn't. And the idea is that we've got 53 tour operators and DMCs currently declared with us. When those 50 DMCs and tour operators have all published a climate action plan, we can look across those and we can start saying, well, what does best practice look like? What would we advise the next tour operator to join to do? How would we advise them to measure? What can we share in terms of case studies? What should they focus upon? Rather than just guessing and giving them the answers because they're what I believe, we were there to provide a community for everyone to come together and work it out together. And hopefully over the course of this year, we can build that across sectors so that by COP26 in November next year, tourism has a far better story to tell, shall we say, in terms of what we are doing about climate action. And which brings me to the end, which therefore I will naturally say, because we want to segue, that we're moving on ahead, who is going to be talking to you about the Fair Climate Fund. And one of the issues that we are naturally talking about inside of this is what is the appropriate way for tourism to address offsets? How should tourism fit offsets into our discussions? Our platform has only been live for 2 days. It's not for me to say what I think my answer is. I'm very keen to hear from Het. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. I will take it over from here. Thank you for the nice bridge to my presentation about offsetting. Maybe a short introduction of Fair Climate Fund. We are a carbon project developer based in the Netherlands. We're part of a larger NGO. It's called ECO. It's an NGO that is globally active, multiple country offices, and has been working for decades already on mainly on poverty alleviation and agri-value change. Tim, maybe next slide. And for us, for Fair Climate Fund, there are two defining issues in our time, and those are climate change and growing inequality. And what we try to do is to address both. A recent report of Oxfam Novib showed that next to the everybody knows a giant inequality gap in terms of income, but the same holds for carbon emissions, and that is what we call a climate inequality. The report shows that the richest 10% of the world's population produce as much as half of world's emissions, while half of the world population only emits 7% of global emissions. So next to economic inequality, there's also a growing climate inequality. Next slide, Tim. And as you look at this map, you see also that the countries that contributed least to climate change, that those are the countries that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So you see it mainly in Africa and Asia and South America. Those areas are, their climate change is having a huge impact, and mainly because these areas are highly dependent on agriculture for their livelihoods. So its FCF mission is to combat both, to at the same time to do something about climate change, but at the same time to reduce inequality. So that is where we are coming from. Next slide, Tim. So what is the role for the corporate sector in this? And we see that as twofold. On the one hand, we think that the corporate sector has a role to play in closing the emissions gap, but also to close the so-called climate finance gap. And I will explain what both mean. If we look at current the Paris pledges, the NDC, so the national determined contributions, that is the agreements that the parties to the UNFCCC have made to cut emissions. If those pledges become reality, then probably we will see a global temperature increase of still 3.2 degrees. That is what our current estimations are. So there's still a huge gap between what we need to reduce and what is currently being planned to reduce in terms of emissions. And there we, as Fair Climate Fund, we see a very important role for the private sector to close that emissions gap. And there's a real need for private sector engagement to close this climate this emissions gap, but also on the other hand for closing the finance gap. The World Resources Institute estimated that by now there's a finance gap of 300 billion annually, and that finance gap refers to the money that is needed to reach the targets, and especially that money is needed in developing countries. So we see the role of the private sector as twofold. That on the one hand, they will have to cut emissions drastically, like is being said earlier. It is going to be net zero by 2050, but emissions have to be cut in half by 2030 to be able to reach this 1.5 degree scenario. And on the other hand, there's a huge need for finance to make that transition possible also in developing countries. And that is where the corporate sector can play a crucial role. We can go to the next slide, Tim. So we talked about offsetting before, and I like to share my vision or our vision on what is the place of offsetting, but it's good to give the proper context before it. Because what we've seen in the past is that offsetting was a matter of we can keep on emitting carbon and keep traveling, keep taking planes everywhere, and as long as we offset emissions, we're carbon neutral. That is not the role of offsetting. It is always, if you look at this pyramid, this is designed by WWF and endorsed by a number of other important organizations in this domain, that the basic of a good climate policy is first to adequately measure and disclose your carbon emissions, and at the same time reducing those, and preferably, like Suzanne and Jeremy already advocated for, with a science-based target. So that means cutting emissions in that way that it is consistent with the 1.5 degree scenario, and for that organizations can also join the science-based target. So I was very happy to hear from Suzanne that their organization has also joined that initiative. That is really what we see as a best practice. And also to engage and advocate cutting carbon emissions within your value chain to other value chain actors, and sharing your plans and ideas with your suppliers, with your clients, and to see how together you can reduce all the carbon emissions in the value chain. But if we're doing this all ourselves within our company boundaries or within our value chain, then we're still not there. Also, the developing countries need to be able to make this transition, and that is why we also need carbon offsetting, and that is what the finance, the pillar 3 refers to. So on top of doing your own efforts within your value chain, we also need to do offsetting, and offsetting can be inside or outside your value chain. When you do it inside your value chain, it's called insetting. When you do it outside your value chain, it's called offsetting. But it's all about closing this climate finance gap. And I think there's the role for offsetting, and it's always on top of your net zero commissions or your science-based target. That is where the role of offsetting is for us. We can go to the next slide, Tim. So how does that look in practice? If you look at the left graph, that is a bit what traditional offsetting is all about. It's about setting sort of a target, or a target that sounds good. We've all heard about 20% in 2020, but that was not necessarily in line with 1.5 degrees. And then the next thing was just keep on emitting carbon and then offsetting your remaining emissions. But that is, for us, that is old world thinking. We need to go to new world thinking, and that means setting, doing research on your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, so your direct and indirect emissions. Then set a net zero target that is science-based, and that has to be net zero before 2050. And then on top of that, you should define a climate finance target to finance the transition. And for us, that is, it's crucial that you choose high quality offset projects that focus and on mitigation and on adaptation. That is very crucial. And what we've seen in the past often is that it was often the case that because companies so badly wanted to become carbon neutral, that they often chose for cheap carbon credits, because that was the only way that they could become carbon neutral and that it would fit within their offset budget. The new world is, I would say, we go for high quality offset projects, and then I would say it's even better to partly offset your emissions with high quality carbon credits than to offset all your emissions with low quality carbon projects. I think we can go to the next slide, to the last slide, Tim. So how does that look in practice, and what we are doing at Fair Climate Fund? What we want to do is to develop a fair carbon value chain. And that is trying to shift away a bit from doing the traditional offset projects that are very singular and dispersed around the world, but we want to create a network of end users, of civil society organizations, of carbon project developers, of retailers and impact buyers to build a sustainable value chain that delivers globally carbon emission reductions. Currently, Fair Climate Fund is working in different areas. We are focusing mainly on two types of offset projects. That is, one is focused on sustainable household energy, and the other ones are focused on nature-based solutions. When we talk about sustainable household energy, it's often projects that are related to clean cooking. So, for example, we have a clean cook stove project in Ethiopia, biogas in India, solar cookers in Chad, and that is all focused on energy efficiency and renewable energy. And then we have the nature-based solutions. They're more focused on carbon sequestration and adapting to climate change. So that is reforestation, that is improved agricultural practices. For example, we have a project in India that promotes mulching instead of stubble burning. In summers, Delhi is totally covered in smoke because of the stubble burning in Punjab. So we're trying to address those kind of topics. But also we're working on forest protection in Colombia. And with these two pillars, we try to combat climate change, but at the same time reach the people that are the most vulnerable to climate change. Sometimes they're called the base of the pyramid, but that is how we see it. That the climate finance should go to the people that are most vulnerable to climate change. And if you think about what is a decent offset project, I've summed up a couple of points what is important to look at. We think that it's first of all, projects should always focus on mitigation and adaptation and contribute to a wider range of SDGs. So not only CO2 reduction, but also address poverty. They should address gender equality, for example, health or biodiversity. Then additionality is very important, an important concept in offsetting. And we have a sort of a different definition than usual, but we say that the cost of a carbon credit should really cover the true cost of reducing those carbon emissions. And they should also be permanent, and they should contribute to future emission reductions. Then it's also important that carbon retailers and carbon developers can also provide you with a transparent picture of how those funds are spent. So don't buy carbon credits if a developer cannot say how these funds are spent. Ask, follow the money. That is very important when you start buying carbon offsets. And also there should be an element of fairness. That means that this climate finance, again, should go to the base of the pyramid, that it should be the end users in the end that should really benefit from climate finance, and not all the parties in between. So not only the developers and carbon retailers and the standards, etc. And the bulk of the finance should really reach the end users or end beneficiaries of those projects. And how we would like to do that, and then I'll give the word to Clara. What we like to do is often together with larger clients to develop customized offset projects. We've developed several offset projects, but that is our plan for the future, to develop customized projects for large corporates or groups of corporates, and projects that really fit with a company's profile and area of work. I think I will keep it with this, and then later there's room for questions if there are more questions about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Gert, for this very nice transition as well. Thank you, Tim and ETOA, for organizing this great conversation, and to my fellow panelists for the really fascinating presentations. I am learning a lot with you. And of course, thank you to everyone joining us remotely for participating in this conversation with us. So what we have seen is that one of the key uses of metrics is to affect behavior, right? When we're speaking about climate change, certainly. So next slide, please, Tim. So I'm sure that, and certainly in a webinar about climate change and tourism, there are many amongst us who like to travel by train, right? Well, I have an interesting story about trains. So when the first railways were being built in the 19th century, engineers laid tracks of varying widths according to their own expert opinion. Railroads were planned to serve cities and their surrounding areas, and trains were manufactured accordingly to these widths. And little thought was given to the fact that these networks would eventually meet. Later on, when people wanted to connect the different railroads together, their trains and tracks proved to be incompatible. So countries had to standardize their rail transport at great expense. Now, something similar is happening in some areas of the measurement of tourism sustainability. Today, we know that for building the measurement systems to connect the world through data and towards common goals, such as sustainability or tackling climate change, we need standardization. Standardization is just as important as in the 19th century world of railroad development. So we need to move data from one place to another. We need to aggregate it. We need to compare it between countries. We need to benchmark our performance. And most importantly, we need to see whether our efforts are paying off and what areas to target. So to do this properly, we need to bring together data from different sources and ensure that they are compiled according to common standards. Now, to achieve such standards, we need internationally agreed frameworks for collecting and organizing data. All popular indicators that we are used to working with, such as GDP or employment figures, are based on such internationally agreed frameworks. In tourism, in fact, we also have two frameworks, one for so-called basic statistics to measure things like tourist flows and their expenditure, their characteristics, and another one to measure the economic contribution of tourism. What we don't have yet is a global standard for measuring elements of sustainability in tourism, and of course the related climate change implications. To fill this gap, next slide please, Tim. To fill this gap, UNWTO launched the Measuring the Sustainability of Tourism program, or MST program. The MST developing a framework to identify the most relevant data and indicators, to integrate different data sets through innovative statistical methods, and to support international comparability of key information. All of this emerging from the building of international consensus and United Nations endorsements. Next slide, please. So this is a visual summary of what the framework looks like. So in fact, the framework spans about 100 pages so far, has 5 chapters, detailing the main concepts, the definitions, the classifications, the accounts, and the tables to organize and integrate information from various sources. Now here, what we can see are the 3 dimensions relevant in sustainability of tourism. Of course, the economic, which is nested in the social, which is nested in the environmental system. Understanding these as nested systems is important to remind ourselves how interconnected they are. Now, according to the internationally agreed definition of tourism, tourism is a social, cultural, and economic phenomena that relies on and has an impact on the economy, the natural and built environment, the local population at the places visited, and on the visitors themselves. Provided this, it's important to have information on tourism's performance in these three dimensions. Now, in the fine print, you will see the different measurement areas to produce data on these three dimensions. And here I would like to highlight that you will find relevant data to better understand both the causes and effects of climate change. So for example, the framework has a chapter on the links between tourism and the environment, where data is integrated for measuring things like water and energy use by tourism, waste and emissions generation, the use of land for tourism purposes, and also tourism from an ecosystems perspective, as well as relevant biodiversity information. In the same way, the social chapter provides information on decent work, on health, education and skills, income and wealth, things like gender, culture and heritage. And another chapter looks at the economic sustainability of tourism. So here we look at things like GDP, the performance of the different tourism industries, which, as we know, the tourism sector covers or includes many different industries, from the transport to the accommodation to the food and beverage serving activities to cultural activities, museums and sports. And it looks, so the framework looks also at the performance of the establishments in these industries, so things like business demographics, employment, and it also looks at visitor expenditure and things like investment under the economic dimension. So it's also important to note that the framework has the ambition to consider data for use at the global, the national, and the subnational level. An entire chapter is in fact dedicated to looking at how to measure at the subnational level. Now, of course, not all aspects have to be measured, nor at all spatial levels. The framework is comprehensive, but it also tries to be responsive to user needs, therefore encouraging a modular implementation by priority areas. In order to identify such priority areas, stakeholders, both data users and data producers, are encouraged to come together and to consider three core elements. The first, what information is most relevant? What is the information, what are the data needs that users have? Second, at what spatial level is this required? What data can be and should be collected at what spatial level to be most relevant? And thirdly, the feasibility of producing and obtaining this information. Now, such a framework, such a common framework for measuring, is sometimes also known as a statistical framework, because a key aim of statistics is to standardize data. Data from whatever source that is produced and compiled in accordance with such statistical standards are known as statistics. So I emphasize the fact that the source is irrelevant here. There may be a variety of sources, a variety of data sets. And if they undergo the statistical filter, the statistical framework filter, if you will, it brings along several benefits. And these benefits include methodological soundness, so what some of you were referring to as science-based. It also has the benefit of transparency, of impartiality and objectivity, and that it embodies a careful assessment from producers and users on the relevance of this data, the accuracy and the reliability, the timeliness, the accessibility, and above all, comparability, which is what we're most interested in. So it's not hard to see how these characteristics of standardized data can make certain types of data more meaningful to stakeholders. So yes, MST is ambitious, and it is also necessary. Next slide, please, Tim. And the good news is that it is also possible. So the MST framework is already producing new data and new data sets. On the one hand, MST has been recognized by the United Nations as the tool to monitor tourism's contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals for global monitoring purposes. As you may know, tourism is explicitly mentioned in these goals under Goal 8 on decent work and growth, and on Goal 12 on responsible consumption and production. And to monitor these, or tourism's contribution in these goals, UNWTO issued 2 new data sets. One on tourism's GDP, right, for Goal 8. And this is shown here in the pink bubbles, the map with the pink bubbles, and another one on the implementation of core MST tables. And this is shown on the green map. Since Tuesday, so we're all launching things this week, indeed. Since this Tuesday, you can access this information on UNWTO's new website for statistics. And in fact, we also, I made use of the opportunity to say that we also launched country fact sheets on our website this week. Now, in addition to these data sets, the work on the MST framework has also been paired with country pilots to test both the relevance and the feasibility of the framework under construction. And this is providing also some very interesting data that I'll be sharing with you in a minute. We also recently issued a publication containing some of these pilots, and a picture of that is shown there. I think it's Amsterdam. So as examples of this kind of information, I'll show you data from 3 MST pilots that have been carried out in Europe, and focusing mainly on the environmental, climate change related data. Next slide, please, Tim. So in Germany, and please just a note that this data is taken out of context and mainly used for illustration purposes. Now that being said, in Germany, we see that tourism accounts for 6% of employment and 4% of value added. Now, comparatively, its energy intensity, or the energy intensity in tourism, is 5% lower than for the economy as a whole. And emissions intensity is 16% higher. This is, quite unsurprisingly, driven mainly by transport activities. However, the water use intensity is less than half that of the total economy. So this is quite interesting. Next slide, please. In Italy, we see that energy intensity is 6% higher than for the whole economy, and emissions intensity is 12% higher, and that these generate comparatively 188% more acidification. Again, this is driven mainly by transport activities, as we might expect. However, and quite interestingly, accommodation and food and beverage services activities in tourism show very low energy and emissions intensity, and in fact much lower than those for the rest of the economy. Now this goes to show the importance of having disaggregated data that is comparable, that you can compare to totals. Next slide, please. In the Netherlands, tourism contributed to 4% of total value added, and compared to this, the environmental contributions of tourism were quite high. It contributed 7% of total emissions, 7% of energy use, and 10% of water use. On the other hand, tourism also contributed relatively higher to government revenues through 7% of all taxes, of environmental taxes being paid by tourism. Now, air transport activities were, again, responsible for the relatively high emissions and the energy use. But, and this is very interesting, they paid relatively few taxes. In fact, environmental taxes were largely paid by land transport and the food and beverage serving industry. So, 2 important lessons that permeate from these country examples. First, that because the data is based on a common framework, on standardized data. The data is comparable between countries. And second, because this common framework is built upon, let's say, the shoulders of, oh no, you can go back. Oh, well, that's fine. That's fine, Tim. I'll continue on this slide. So second, because this framework is built on and consistent with other measurement standards, such as the standards for measuring the economy or for measuring the environment, this data, this environmental data on tourism can be compared to things like economic data, like GDP and value added. It can be compared to data on other economic sectors. So how is tourism and its different sub-industries comparing to the performance of other industries, such as agriculture, finance, or whatever. So such data insights could motivate action, and it can motivate more targeted action to help tackle climate change. Now, this final slide, I'll say some words on all of those who are leading MSD with their hard work, enthusiasm, and support. So in the middle, you will see the countries, and to the right, in the institutions involved in MSD, those who have carried out pilots, those who have reviewed different versions of the framework, those who have contributed valuable lessons and insights, and some of those even funded some MSD activities. And on the left, you will see the different international fora that have supported the MSD program of work. These include the highest levels, both in policy and tourism policy, so the UNWTO General Assembly, and it includes the highest levels in the statistical community, the UN Statistical Commission. And more recently, it was also supported by the G20. Now, a framework only becomes a standard if it reaches international consensus. So more formally, it requires endorsements by the United Nations. This is why the governance of MSD and its process of consensus building follows UN procedures and established best practices. As part of this, a working group of experts on MSD was set up in coordination between UNWTO Madrid and UN headquarters in New York, that is leading the overall MSD program of work. It consists of many of the entities shown on this slide, and it is responsible for driving the overall program of work of MSD, which includes the development of the framework, the consensus building efforts, the development of new data, as well as capacity building and support to countries.
Can I just jump in a second, please?
Yes,
we have one or two questions which I'd like to have time for before our hour is up. So if I could just ask you to close quite soon, please, Clara.
You're absolutely right. I'm going overboard. So so anyway, just to sum up, to say that as we're aiming for an international consensus, it's important that all stakeholders more or less find themselves in this effort. And for this reason, the MSD program welcomes experts to join the working group, participation in the different consultations of the framework, as well as the development of additional pilot studies. We look forward to learning from all of you and to seeing with you whether this framework is going in the right direction to suit your data needs. Thank you very much.
Wow, well, I hope everyone was taking notes. That was a huge amount of information from our four speakers. And I think all we can hope to do in this initial webinar on this topic is to give a sense of the wide landscape there is in terms of what options there are for industry. But I think particularly the theme I'm picking out from all of this is it's a multilateral approach that's going to be required in order to achieve anything. So from Clara's compatibility of data collection and whether or not you can do benchmarking cross-country if data is not collected in the same way, to Jeremy saying this really is a networked industry and then you can't operate in silos. This is not about finger pointing, it's not a blame game, it's about being part of a solution, not anything more negative. So couple of thoughts that have come up in questions, and first really to put to all of you is a commercial one. Tourism is based on discretionary spending. It's about people choosing to spend their money on leisure travel. What are your thoughts on how the importance of sustainability and the evidence around the sustainability of products and services, how important is that for consumers? Do you see that changing? Is this part of the context for discussion? Maybe Suzanne, you could start there. Just quick remarks, please.
Yep, very quick. I guess I go back to our climate journey or the start, 2005, when our climate journey started. We actually took customers of ours to watch The Inconvenient Truth. And afterwards, we also run a survey with our customers and potential customers. And actually what we heard back was like that they wanted us to take more action on climate change. That was one of many reasons why we actually did then become carbon neutral in 2010. Going to 2019, like climate strikes last year, where we closed our offices around the globe and joined the students, declaring the climate emergency in January, we certainly see positive feedback from customers, kind of congratulating us on the fact that we're taking these steps.
Cool. One theme again is about sharing good ideas, and I think both Geert and Jeremy touched on this in some detail, that it's quite hard to do the right thing if you're busy, particularly if you're running a small business, you've got a lot on your mind, particularly survival in current times, but someone else may have done the work. And one of the encouraging and interesting aspects about this whole discussion is that people are sharing good practice. Mm-hmm. So even though there may be a commercial benefit to a company in adopting a more pro-climate action policy, people are still sharing what they're doing, because collectively this is something we all need to be on board with. That seems to be the spirit this is going on. So Geert and Jeremy, maybe just very quick reflections on, where do you see the challenges in just helping people do the right thing or find out what the options are in a way that's not preachy, it's not wagging a finger, it's here's a useful tool for you. I know, Geert, you've adapted your platform so that companies can work with you in order to organize their carbon offsetting through consumers or through direct contribution. But offsetting one of the elements that Jeremy referred to, but are we seeing a cultural shift, particularly now that science is seen as more fundamental to public policy due to the pandemic, perhaps, than it has been before? So even though we wouldn't have wished it, is the current public appetite for science-based solutions going to help, and is it going to be easier to find tools to do the right thing and adapt? So Jeremy, would you like to start there, please?
Okay. Picking up at the end of that question, talking about is the current situation be easier? While I'm reticent to talk about opportunities that we've been provided by this crisis, I think the one thing that I see is that those few economies, societies that seem to be emerging more rapidly from this are those that acted first and fast, and that said we need to do what is necessary to respond to this emergency regardless of the short-term economic cost. And those that said let's take a more incremental approach and let's try to balance economic situations with the issue around the crisis are those that are struggling. This is a generalization, but are those that are struggling more greatly. And that has shown that we have to, in these sort of situations, we need to act fast and to make those commitments now, and that will then provide the economic opportunities as we move forward. In terms of working out where we should make changes individually, I mean, that is very much what we have set out to do, because the nature of our disparate industry spread across every region and every ecosystem of the world is that what you might want to do if you're a rural lodge in a mountain region compared to a city business hotel is going to be very different. But standardizing frameworks, as Clara was talking about, will help us. Understanding where it is perhaps not necessarily worth spending a huge amount of time and money in the short term can help people from not investing in issues, in solutions that aren't necessarily there, but end up being some sort of expensive virtue signaling. And quite often we find that the low-hanging fruit, small levels of behavior change and engaging with one's staff can make huge amounts of difference at a very low cost and at a very short time of return.
So actually, we're nearly run out of time, but I do see a very interesting resonance thinking about aviation. A lot of European tourism is dependent on long-haul aviation, and one of the projects, or a lot of the projects that you're running, for example, in India is seen as an important source market for Europe. So from a business perspective, I wonder if you see, again, any opportunities. So for businesses who are seeking to bring Indian visitors to Europe, do you think it's likely that they're going to see a symmetry in contributing to offsetting schemes which have benefit long-term to the broader community in India? Or is that too easy a comparison to make?
Yeah, to respond to that, I think the bigger picture is that we need a lifestyle change, right? And that in all fairness, that's not going to be easy. So that I think that is the broader picture, and that is really something we need to think about, whether our current lifestyle and our current personal carbon footprint, whether that is sustainable, and what does that mean for tourism in the future and for our children. And that is something, I think that's where it starts with. On a smaller level, okay, that's the big picture. What can we do now? And that is also important to think about. And Jeremy also already said it. There are some quick wins. And for example, if I talk about our domain, about carbon offsetting, there's a lot of quick wins to make on carbon offsetting, right? Be really critical on how you offset your carbon. Is it purely that you want to offset your emissions for the outside world and you don't really care about what is behind those offsets, or do you really care about what is happening with that offset money you are investing? Is that really going to the right places? That is what you should be very, very critical about, and that is what we are willing to assist in, because it's a very difficult market to understand. In that sense, I want to offer, there's also an offer for ETOA. We're here to help and to make the right decisions in that. I think that could be a quick win. And the other one is, for example, there's now a very good framework for reducing emissions, and that is the Science-Based Target Initiative. Those would be my two very concrete recommendations to start working on.
That's clear. We're out of time, but Clara, you've been listening to those remarks. Just from the point of view of measurement, can I just ask you, do you see any obstacles? What is stopping a quicker read across, and particularly a simplification? Because it's very complicated, the various things to measure. The National Statistics Department, they've all got their various ways of working, but is there a core set of data that you would like to see people collecting in a systematic way in order to allow the benchmarking and the progress along the IPCC ambition that Jeremy described? So is there something in the way stopping us getting a really core set of metrics that are going to help us tell quickly whether we're on the right path or not? Sorry, your micro, please.
Thank you for the question, Tim. And you're absolutely right. So, and someone mentioned this before, right? There's a difference between what many of us are saying and what many of us are actually doing, right? From UNWTO, we believe that metrics and measurement can try and smooth over this gap to target action better. Now, there are two things. So on the one hand, we have to be holistic, right? So we have to be comprehensive. If something has come out of the different presentations is that climate change is complex. Climate change involves many different elements and not only emissions. So we need to track both the causes of climate change in a comparable way, which indeed, so the framework we're working on is based on international standards in this area as well. And on the other hand, we have to look at the different effects of climate change. And I think Jeremy pointed in this direction as well, right? So the changing uses of land, things like risk, investments, of course, that had looked into changing consumer behavior in this area, right? So we have to be holistic. At the same time, we have to be brave to look at ourselves in the mirror and to act upon what we see. Of course, there's a political dimension to all of this, but indeed, climate change is very much political. So perhaps with more metrics, more comprehensive metrics, we can overcome some of these hurdles.
No, I think that's very right. And from a political perspective, we know that sustainability together with digitalization will be the two twin pillars of major EU strategic thinking over the next years. So we're very appreciative of all four of you giving us such a thought-provoking stimulus to our thinking. This is something that we need to get on with. We can't leave it in the category of something interesting to talk about. Thank you very much for giving us some practical ideas as to how individual businesses can get started and can connect with people who may be further along the journey and can see the opportunities that climate action adoption is giving their businesses. So I'm sure this conversation will continue, but for now, thank you very much to Suzanne, Jeremy, Clara and Geert for your very, very insightful commentary. I'm sure we'll meet again on a screen somewhere near you soon. Thank you to our audience for staying with us. Quick goodbye from everyone, and I'll close this webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.